Hi everyone, and welcome to this Open Courtauld Hour on British art, immigration and migration. Just want to start by saying sorry in advance for the noise of fireworks and dogs barking, which I think is just in everyone's background at the moment. For those who haven't been to an Open Courtauld event before, I'm Layla Bumbra and I'm the Open Courtauld producer. It's so lovely to have so many of you tuning in, and I really hope that we can give you all a break from the reality that is 2020, even if it is just for an hour. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Tonight we'll take a magazine format with 2 short in-conversations, a presentation, and a one-off performance to round up the hour. If you have any questions for our panelists, please send these via social media, Twitter or Instagram, with the hashtag OpenCourtauldHour to @CourtauldRes. And if you don't have any social media, you can also email these to researchforum@courtauld.ac.uk. Okay, so now on to what tonight is all about. As someone who comes from a family who moved to the UK from India in the 1960s, I believe that from migration and makers to immigrants and innovation, the landscape of British art and culture has been moulded by the movement of people. In my opinion, families like mine have been a cornerstone of British art, and this hour will both trace and celebrate voices which have often been hidden or displaced from the mainstream narrative of art history. So this hour actually evolved from the concept of our collective memory. So I wanted us to recognise the diversity of our past, but also the fact that this diversity that we see now in 2020 didn't come out of nothing. It's not new. Because as humans, we actually made the active choice to decide whose stories we felt were important in our national consciousness. Saying that though, the speakers tonight will show that stories can and are being traced and resurrected, and recognition is being granted in powerful placement of blue plaques, and more broadly on social media and in our art galleries and museums. So as always with Open Courtauld Hour, it's designed to be the starting point for what we hope will become a constructive push to create an inclusive history and also to start critical conversations. I am very aware we cannot do justice to this whole topic in an hour, but hopefully you will all start looking deeper into the perspectives of some of the people we discussed this evening, or maybe even be inspired to do your own detective work. And please do get back to us with anything you've discovered. So I am now delighted to introduce our first speaker, Anna. So Anna Eavis is Curatorial Director of English Heritage, with responsibility for the presentation of over 400 historic sites and their collections. Anna, it's so fantastic to have you here this evening. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, Layla. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
Great. So if we could have the slides that you've made up, that'd be wonderful, and we'll get started. Thank you, Grace. So Anna, I know that we both appreciate what a vital role there is for arts and cultural institutions to be more diverse. And I think this is true, especially when creating an intersectional selection of awards for blue plaques as part of the work that you do for English Heritage. So I would say that this should include, a range of ethnicities, religions, races, genders, sexualities, and classes. So I was wondering if you could start by saying a little bit more about this and the need for more public nominations for people of colour in order to address the racial imbalance as it stands.
Yes, I might just kick off by saying something briefly about the Blue Plaque scheme, because perhaps not everybody knows what it is. English Heritage runs the Blue Plaque scheme, which is a London scheme. And this scheme was set up over 150 years ago. It's probably the first of its kind in the world. And the slide you can see has all those little blue and white squares, which are representative of the vast number of plaques that have been put up over the last 150 years, over 900 plaques. And it's inevitable, I guess, that with a scheme of such long life, that it's not very representative, to be honest. So there are lots and lots of white men, and there are far fewer women and even fewer people of Black or Asian minority ethnic origin. And whilst that is to some extent inevitable, given, as I say, the kind of antiquity of the scheme, as we are still carrying on, we put up 12 new plaques every year, we're keen to try and increase the representation of the scheme. Could I have the next slide, please? This is just to show you how on a London street a blue plaque might look. And this plaque, which is to a woman in Spitalfields, is just shows you how it features in the streetscape. The blue colour, which was arrived on actually not at the beginning of the scheme, but rather later, was chosen because it was distinctive. You can see it in the streetscape, but it doesn't spoil the look of the building. It's a sympathetic colour, and it's a very beautiful colour, in fact. We have the next slide. And it's a free scheme. It's free history. So the idea, very simple idea, which is probably why it's been so enduring, was simply to associate a person who had done something amazing, made a great contribution to society, with the building in which they lived and worked. And that's what we continue with today. And what's so powerful about that is that it gives every person walking down the street free access to a little glimpse of a story, a little glimpse of a connection between a person and a building. And for that reason, because the scheme is all about peopling in a historical way our streetscapes, it's very important that that reflects the diversity of the society that has occupied those buildings. The scheme is driven by public nomination, so anybody, anywhere, can nominate somebody for a blue plaque. And what we're trying to do is encourage the public to send in nominations for women. That campaign's been very successful, and also for people of different ethnic origins.
Yeah, that's great. Do you know what? It's so interesting, and I think you've just basically touched on this, but there was a blue plaque where I grew up in Anstruther, which is a tiny, tiny fishing village in Scotland, and it was for a Tahitian princess. And honestly, everyone I speak to, I went to primary school with, vividly remembers this. And it was just so interesting in such a tiny place that people of colour and their imprint was, recognised. And it was really important to me as a child, as the only person in my year who wasn't white and wasn't, Scottish. So I think, it's fantastic. So I also wanted to ask as well about the importance of, public realm schemes like this being so representative and telling actually the whole story.
Well, it is really important. And I've got the picture I've got up here is to Noor Inayat Khan, whose plaque went up this summer, actually. She was the first plaque to go up after lockdown. So that was great for us. And as you can see from her plaque, she was a spy. I mean, she was a wireless operator, in fact, terrifically courageous. And she died, at the hand of the Gestapo. Very, very brave. Now, I'm showing you this slide, everybody, because I'm ashamed to say, but also kind of proud, that this is the first blue plaque in London to a woman of South Asian origin. And when we put the plaque up, I've been kind of conscious for a few years that there was this gap, and we have been hoping somebody would be nominated. We've been looking for somebody. And when we did put the plaque up to Noor, there was such a huge interest in it. I mean, I think we've had more interest in this plaque than any other that I have been involved with. And I've been involved with the scheme since 2014. And we, it was more popular than Freddie Mercury and Bob Marley. So, that shows, I mean, the point you're making, Nadia, I think, it's a very, people want to see these figures, they don't just want to be looking at, members of the Bloomsbury Group forever, marvellous as the Bloomsbury Group is. It's important that people can look up, and see, different sorts of people from themselves, but also see something they can recognise and relate to in the way that you did.
Yeah, and Noor was such an amazing figure, and I actually hadn't heard about her in the context of the UK. I lived in France, and they celebrate her immensely. And it just, when I heard about this plaque, I was like, I need to read the book. So I read up quite a lot. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about displaying of a portrait of the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, Sarah Forbes Bonita. So this is a part of a plan to feature works of overlooked Black figures connected with English heritage sites. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this and the woman herself.
Sure. Could we skip actually the next slide, go on one more? That's it. Yeah, so there she is. Sarah Forbes Bonetta. And this is an extraordinary story about a woman, a girl, as you can see her on the left. She was actually born not called Sarah at all, called Inna. She was born in what's now southwest Nigeria. And when she was 5, her parents were killed in a massacre. And she was captured along with members of her community and taken to a neighbouring country, where she was held and probably would have become a slave. And she was, an amazing thing happened to her, which was that when she was about 7, a British Navy captain arrived in this country. So this is modern day, well, it's sort of next to Nigeria. It's sort of, and this captain was trying to promote, as the British were by then, this is 1850, the abolition of the slave trade, that Britain having been a major exponent of slave trading and slavery for a long time, had then abolished slavery in its empire, and we're now trying to promote abolition elsewhere. So this captain, Frederick Forbes, was on a mission to try and persuade the king of Dalmany to stop slaving. And he was not successful in that mission, but during the course of that meeting, the king gave him many gifts. And one of the gifts, appallingly enough, was this girl. And here she is on the left-hand side, drawn by Frederick Forbes, this little girl. And he took her back to England as a gift for Queen Victoria. Now, he was very taken with this child and was very kind to her. And he thought she was wonderful. What is interesting about that is that it was very benign, his attitude towards her, but there was a way in which he was astonished that a Black African child like this could be intelligent and agreeable and civilized. Now, here she is, she's dressed in European clothes. He took her back to England, having christened her before leaving the coast of Africa, giving her this name, Sarah, Forbes after his own name, Bonetta after the name of his ship. He took her back to England, and she was presented to Queen Victoria, who wrote about her in her diary. She was also very affected by this child, who by then could speak English already. She was, she was very intelligent and quick. And Queen Victoria decided that she would contribute to her education and welfare. So Sarah was then educated, she was accepted into high society, and she was married. And as I say, what's interesting about, it's a fascinating story, and she was quite clearly a remarkable woman and able to cope with these sort of seismic shifts in her life. But as I say, what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about her story is that it tells us a lot about the changing attitudes to race and cultural identity in the second half of the 19th century after abolition. And quite a lot of her story is really quite uncomfortable. But all of this was very much done in a spirit of kindness and benevolence and Christianity. So it's a really important story. We wanted to highlight it. And here we've got, on the right-hand side, a portrait that was painted this year by the artist Hannah Eavis, showing Sarah in her finery in the 1860s. And Hannah, who talks very eloquently about Sarah's story, was really, really keen to explore an image of a Black woman in a very high status dress, a rich Black woman. And it's a marvelous painting. We put it on show at Osborne House in October. Osborne House being the home of Queen Victoria on the Isle of Wight. And again, it was a story that had a lot of attention. People were really interested to see it, to hear about it.
Yeah, I hadn't actually heard about Sarah before I'd seen it on BBC, because there was obviously such an uptake in it. So yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it probably speaks more widely to the push that you're doing to include more people that are usually written out of history books. So I think the project more generally is going to encompass many more migrant and immigrant figures. So I wondered if you had anyone else you wanted to spotlight that you've been researching recently.
Well, the idea, as you say, is that we've commissioned some artists to work on doing some portraits of other Black figures associated with our sites, and we've actually shared with them a short list of names, and they're going to choose which figures they work on. I suppose what I would love to draw your attention to is the work that's been done on Porchester Castle, which is on the south coast. If you Google English Heritage Porchester Castle, Caribbean, you will find that in the 1790s, 2,500 Caribbean prisoners of war were arrived at Porchester Castle. It was during the Napoleonic Wars. They had been captured and they were resident in Porchester, which is quite near Portsmouth, for several years. And that's a really remarkable story. And we do have very interesting accounts of individuals there and some historical drawings as well. So I'm really excited about that story, and I'm hoping that one of our artists might be interested in taking up one of them.
I'm sure they will be. So that's all of my questions, actually. And we have a question from the audience. Has English heritage faced pushback from those who believe inclusion equals erasure of history, forced diversity, or similar when making the move to expand the Blue Plaque scheme?
Well, I'm very clear that what we're trying to do here is tell a fuller story. I'm not actually in favour personally of removing things, because I think the presence of things, the presence of some contested items actually are very important in terms of us understanding our past. So, sometimes we do get questions or criticism about increasing diversity. But because I think I am at pains to show that what we're trying to do here is present multiple perspectives and tell multiple stories, and we're not taking anything away, actually. We're just trying to increase understanding.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when people do question things like that, I just go, but maybe you need to think, why am I worried about other people's stories being shown?
I think the really important thing is to be able to have a kind of civilized discussion. I mean, it's some of it's bumpy. We've kind of got to face up to that and talk about it.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Anna. It was really great to talk to you, and it's been really fascinating. It's wonderful to see how much work is actually going on, especially during our second lockdown. I'm sure in the next month you'll come back to us with loads more to say. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And so that brings us perfectly on to our next speaker. We are moving on from named figures who had substantial privilege and wealth comparatively to the general populace, I'd say, to figures from the margins of society, so nannies of South Asian descent who were brought to the UK by the families they served. So I'm delighted to introduce Farhanah Mamoojee, who is the founder of Ayah's Home project, which aims to commemorate the sacrifice and lives of a group of migrant women known as Ayahs. So welcome, Farhanah. It's such a pleasure to have you here for Open Courtauld Hour and talk more about Ayahs and their legacy in the streets of London and beyond.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great, thank you so much for having me. And it was great to hear Anna speak as well, because obviously, as I'll expand on later, I've also been involved in the Blue Plaque project, but from the side of doing an application for the Ayah's Home. So
Great.
Thank you for having me.
No, we're very excited you're here. So, just like that, I didn't even need to ask.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, so I wanted to start by saying that I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but my vision of Ayahs is definitely very rose-tinted based on depictions in stories and films that I used to watch when I was a child. So I think of A Little Princess, A Secret Garden, and they're probably prime examples that feed into I'd probably phrase it as a colonial idea of exotic India. So something that's equally tantalizing and dangerous, but also you see the complete servitude of Ayahs as well, who are devoted to their wards in a lot of those scenes, especially Mary in A Secret Garden. I really remember as a child her saying her Ayah cared for her more than her parents. So yeah, I wanted to start by asking you if you could tell us a little bit more about who Ayahs were, the project you've been working on, and when you first discovered this home and how it's evolved since then.
So I was the same as you actually. I'd heard of Ayahs briefly, sort of tangentially, but hadn't really given them that much thought. And again, I've watched The Secret Garden about 15 times as a child and hadn't really thought about the Ayah as much until I came across the Ayah's home in Hackney. So there was a documentary about 2 years ago now during the 72nd anniversary of partition, and it was basically a historian that went through the first passenger lists of ships that came to the UK, and she was tracing back the first sort of migrants from India to the UK, and she traced back a man who came as a boy with an Ayah, and she finds him. He's like an elderly gentleman now, English, and he doesn't remember anything about his Ayah since she left the family or she was, discharged from her service. And he recalls, her memories of having her in his life, but nothing else since that, which for me just felt a bit like, wow, she was kind of like your second mother, and then you had no idea what happened to her. And the historian in the documentary, it's called Passage to Britain. It came on the BBC. So she goes into some detail for a couple of minutes, basically talking about how this wasn't an isolated incident. There were tons of these women from all over Asia who came as nannies, who were abandoned by various families, and there became so many that this home had to be set up in Hackney. And I live in East London, and I thought I was really clued up on all the local history there because I'm so into it. So obviously we have like the East End suffrage movement, there's loads of migrant history there, and obviously there's a huge South Asian population. And I had just never come across this, which kind of culminates everything. It's history of women, history about migrants, history about South Asian women. And I just thought, how have I never heard of this? So I walked to the home. It looks almost exactly the same. There's actually two of the former sites on the same street. And I thought there would be an information board or maybe even a blue plaque. There was nothing, absolutely nothing there at all. And the whole story really, really touched something in me. And I thought, if I'm really interested in this, there's got to be a few other people or maybe a few hundred people who would be interested in this too. And it all kind of snowballed from there. So I did a blue plaque application, it got shortlisted. And then to kind of celebrate that shortlisting, we held an academic event at Hackney Museum, also with some spoken word, just so we can try and create a new way of engaging with these women's voices, which have been completely lost. So it kind of just has grown so much, and we've had so much support. There's been an overwhelming response from the public and from press about this story. So I set up an Instagram page to kind of create a space to document all the images that I could find of Ayahs, all the stories that I could find, personal stories that have come out of the woodwork. And yeah, we're just hoping for that blue plaque now, which will be amazing.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fantastic project, and I can see why so many people are so interested in it. So you come from an art history background, don't you? And you've been using your Instagram account that you've just mentioned to shine a light on little known images, so photographs, artworks, and film depictions of Ayahs. Is there any specific work or works that you wanted to say a little bit more about just now?
Yeah, I think we can start with the image just on this homepage at the moment. It's one of the most well-known images because it was obviously used to promote the Ayah's home and what it was doing. So you can see on the top, it says London City Mission. So the home was actually run by a missionary group. So you get a sense of what was really behind the premise of the home. So it wasn't just to house abandoned women, which was its primary function, but it had an underlying theme in that it was run by a missionary group. So their whole premise was to convert these women, which sounds great and rosy on the surface, but you can just imagine the undertones of they have already come from a completely different country, would have had completely different language skills, completely different clothing, had their own culture, had their own religion, which they might have wanted to retain. But we don't know what went on in that home. And there have been letters from the matron, which still exist, where she mentions something like, quiet talks in the bedroom, which can come across as quite sinister. And then important to remember that although this looks very nice and formal, a lot of these photographs taken by the mission were staged. So there's actually, if you look on the British Library website, there's a great photograph where they're all sitting inside and they're sat round a table. They look very demure. They're sewing, knitting, reading the Bible, but that was all propaganda. And then if we could have the next slide. A lot of paintings that I've come across with ayahs are generally more this kind of theme. So a lot of colonial families who went to India paid to have these expensive paintings done of them. And you start to question why it was necessary to have the ayah in that painting. And ayahs became sort of like a social status, in that if you had an ayah, it meant that you were of the tier where you could have so many servants in India looking after your children. You know, a household there would have up to 12 or 15 servants or more. And what is really particular about paintings in this style is that the ayah is always sat on the floor. So you can see in this painting, she's just to the side of the mother who's on a seat holding the baby. The ayah is sat on the floor, everyone else is slightly raised, and she's looking up at her superiors. And that was very typical of these types of paintings. And if we could just have the next slide. This is another really famous painting by Johann Safani, which is in the Tate, and shows another sort of aspect of how ayahs were portrayed by the public. So it doesn't look like it, but the figure to the far right in the red scarf is an ayah, but she looks like a child. She's even shorter than the child who she's supposedly looking after, which is quite interesting. And the reason this was the case is because ayahs were always depicted as being very docile, very childlike, easier to control, very demure, and it kind of takes away from everything you could imagine they would be. So a lot of ayahs were actually mothers themselves because they worked also as nursemaids. They were mature, you know, they had their own agenda in life, their own multifaceted personalities, but these types of paintings take away from all of that. And so it's important that we remember that this was something that these painters and the families who obviously commissioned these paintings, they were trying to portray about the ayahs, but the genuineness of the ayah has been completely lost. Interestingly, you never really see other English portraits or family portraits with their servants in the paintings, especially not so forefront or in the center of the family unit. They're always to the side, or there'll be something hinting at the fact that the family would have help. So it is really interesting to note that the ayahs in these paintings are always in the foreground, and your eyes sort of drawn to them immediately. And something I learned very recently is that the darker dye used for the paint for the paintings of the ayahs were actually a product of colonial labor as well. So there's that other tie into the materials of drawing colonial subjects was done by colonial laborers. Yeah, those are the things I think that I didn't. Can we go to the next slide? The reason I put this one in as well is it's really interesting because it was the first painting I came across of a mixed race family who had an ayah. So this was Major William Harper with his second wife, who you can see on the floor holding the baby, and she's got an adorned headdress. And what was really interesting is she is obviously of Indian origin, and the ayah is raised. So there's maybe multiple ayahs in this painting because there's two children. So the two ayahs on the side who always customarily wear white saris, they're raised higher than the rest of the family. And I just thought that was very interesting considering that the family in this picture were of Indian origin. So really interesting to see the contrast there.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I also think the fact that in the paintings they come across a little bit, in the previous ones anyway, as commodities rather than people, it's really interesting. So another work that I find really striking that you've been looking at is one of Fanny Eaton that was displayed at the National Portrait Gallery's Pre-Raphaelite Sisters, which catalogue I'm actually using to hold my laptop right now, funnily enough. So Fanny Eaton was Jamaican and posed regularly as an exotic figure in Pre-Raphaelite paintings. And I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about why you think in the cultural consciousness at that point, they assumed that races were all homogenized when thinking or displaying ayahs.
So that's really interesting because in a lot of written materials that we have about the ayahs or about Indians in general during that time, they are described as black. So there was no, you know, differentiation. It was just white and black. So any other race that wasn't white was described as black. So I think that might be a reason why Fanny was so needed as sort of a model in that time, because they had no one else really who was in the same social circle as them. And we actually have the image on the next slide. If we could flip. Oh, I missed this one out. I think, Fanny, can we go forward one slide and I'll come back to this one? I think it's 2 slides actually, sorry, Grace. Maybe it's 3 slides. Yes, this is one, sorry. The other reason I think this one is so interesting is because it was painted by a woman. Sorry, can we go back 1 slide, Grace? Thank you so much. It was painted by a woman, and a lot of the paintings that we see are actually painted by men, so they're very, very different. And this one is actually called The Young Teacher. And Fanny there, you can see wearing kind of traditional clothing with a headdress, and she's got 2 children, one on her lap who's holding a doll and one on the side who's actually pointing at the book. And there was supposed to be some sort of satirical play on this, in that it looks like the girl with it pointing to the book is actually teaching the Ayah, again pointing to the same kind of messaging in all these paintings, in Ayahs being very docile, you know, unintelligent, but she seems completely disinterested. She's not even looking at her charge or at the book, she's just off into the distance, which I really love. And that exhibition in itself, I was not expecting to find, you know, this subject, so I was really excited by it as well. I think if we go back to the other slides that we zoomed past, I would love to talk about those because they are very different depictions of Ayahs. Can we go to the zoomed out, just one more? Yes. So this one, when I first came across it, it was actually Rosina Visram who took me through this. And she said, you know, this is a really famous painting of going north at King's Cross Station, London. And at the time she was describing it to me, I couldn't think what this had to do with Ayahs, because I couldn't really see past, you know, all the dogs, so many people, the train, it just looks really chaotic. And then if you go to the next slide, yes, you'll see right in the center of the whole painting is this scene. And there's an Ayah right there in the red cloak. And the more you look at this painting, you realize there's a synergy there between the child and the Ayah. So the child is completely overwhelmed by everything that's happening in the station. There's like tons of dogs. I've actually never seen that many dogs in a train station. You can imagine the noise of the crowds, the steam train, all of these luggage carts, everything. And the child is completely bewildered. And she doesn't immediately run to her parents, who I'm assuming are the 2 figures in the background there. She runs to her Ayah. Her Ayah is the one who has her arms held out, who's embracing the child, and you know, they're wearing coloured cloaks. So this really speaks to the importance of the Ayah in the family unit and the bond that they would have shared with their charges, which doesn't come across in the paintings that I showed you guys earlier. So this is really important. And then the next slide, thank you, kind of speaks to the same theme, in the Ayah being a really integral part of the children's childhood, their families, their whole family unit. So the center figure here is the Ayah. She's the Ayah of the children of Edward Cruttenden, and this is a Reynolds painting. And she doesn't look like your typical Ayah. She's wearing embroidered clothing that almost mirrors the children in this painting. She's adorned, she's wearing jewelry, she's elevated higher than them, she's not sat on the floor. So this again speaks to that really close family bond and importance that the Ayah had in the children's lives and the family's lives, which again didn't come across in other paintings. So there really was a huge variety of how Ayahs were depicted, and I think almost there was kind of like a tug of war. So even though they were so important to the family and the children loved them and, you know, called them about everything, they missed them so much when they were gone, there was also the need to keep the Ayah in her place in, you know, this imperial colonial structure, in where they needed to be the docile, subservient woman.
Great, yeah. I just wanted to ask if there's any more works you want to show us just now before we move on
Yes.
to the question.
If we could just go to the next slide after the Fanny Eaton picture. Okay, so this is a really interesting example I came across. It's the children of Sir John Spencer in Lucknow, and what's interesting is it's actually by an Indian artist who, coincidentally, his name has not been recorded through history. But it's a very, very sinister painting. So you can see the Ayah to the right, she's holding a baby, and there's another small Indian servant and their daughter. And I imagine the child on the rocking horse to be the only son, and he's wielding a whip. And it just looks very sinister, and it kind of speaks a lot to the power that, you know, the males had in the household, especially over their female counterparts, and then the servants as well. So just a really interesting example. Next slide, please. And then this one is a really, I think sometimes I find this very uncomfortable to look at, but this is actually by Thomas Hickey, who had done the very first painting I had showed you of the family. And this is called Portrait of a Young Boy with Ayah. And it's just completely different to his other paintings, which makes me think it maybe wasn't commissioned. It was something he did on his own, and it's really through his gaze. So as you can see, it's very sexualized, very sensualized. The Ayah's back is completely bare. I can't imagine an Indian woman ever wearing a sari like this as she's working in a household. Definitely wouldn't have been blue. They traditionally only ever wore white. And you've got this very sensual red drapery, and the young boy is completely naked on his bed. But it's not a very typical image you'd see of a child. He's like lounging almost. And it makes you think of the male gaze. So obviously Thomas Hickey had seen something not exactly like this, but he looked at it through this lens. He's really sexualized the Ayah, and maybe that's him as a young boy, who knows. But it really brings to mind the way that Ayahs may have been treated, what they might have been subjected to in a household, and how they might have been seen as prey to, you know, the male members that they served. So yeah, very, very different picture of an Ayah I've ever seen, and still very uncomfortable for me to look at sometimes.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. And then you briefly mentioned about the commodification of Ayahs, which is definitely the case, so much so that they were made into postcards. So this postcard was it was shot in India and made in England for people back home to have a look at. And they really were just a novelty item in the end. So even at the missionary, they were taught to sing hymns and all this kind of stuff, which they were then made to perform in public, and it became a thing. So you saw an Ayah, you saw these women who looked completely exotic, for want of a better word. You know, they wore these pristine white saris, they had their nose pierced, they had gold bangles, and they were singing English hymns. So yeah, they really were a novelty. And then the next slide is a really fantastic picture of these two Ayahs in Scotland, actually. So there are actually a lot of records that I found in the British newspaper archives of ships and passengers coming into Scotland, and a lot of them record Ayahs travelling with these families. And I absolutely love this photograph because you can see how unfazed these Ayahs are. They're so used to being photographed, and they've also completely adapted to the cold, you know, British weather. They're wearing their saris, but they've teamed up with woolly cardigans, scarves, gloves, and the person who looks the most shocked that their photo's been taken is the child, not the Ayahs. They're probably so used to it. But a really brilliant photograph, and it's great. And
yeah, I absolutely love that one. It's great. It really reminds me of all my grandma, and then also all my older aunties would always do this, wear their saris with massive cardigans that would come down to their knees.
Yeah,
it's great. So we have a question about what Ayah means, if it means auntie, and if in what language it is.
So the word Ayah originates from Portuguese. So obviously there was a lot of Portuguese colonies in India when they colonized South India, and it basically means nanny. So there are two different words that we generally use when describing South Asian or Southeast Asian nannies. So South Asian nannies are primarily called Ayahs, and the Southeast Asian equivalent is Ammas. So in the Ayah's home, there were both Ayahs and Ammas, because they were from everywhere, from China, Burma, Singapore, India, Bengal, everywhere. So yeah, it's just been, I think it's still being used nowadays because Ayahs still exist, but obviously have been contemporized and it's more just like a normal nanny.
Great, thank you. And just before we move on to our next speaker, if you wanted to just say how people can find you and also share any stories that they might have about Ayahs or any works that they've found.
Yes, that would be amazing. So I have an Instagram page at Ayah's Home, and we've had some really fantastic stories coming out of the woodwork, and there's so much research that has been spurred on by my project. So that's been really, really promising to see, and loads of things have been coming out of the woodwork. So if you have any photographs of Ayahs that may have served in your families, or even better, if you are a descendant of an Ayah, that would be like my dream goal. I would love to hear from you, so please do get in touch.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction, and I'm sure everyone at home will agree it's really interesting, and I hope you get lots more pictures and information about Ayahs.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So now I am delighted to introduce Sarah. So Sarah MacDougall is director of Ben Uri Gallery. She has lectured widely at institutions including the Courtauld itself, Imperial War Museum, National Portrait Gallery, Reading University, Senate House, Tate Britain, and Whitechapel Art Gallery. And recently, she's collaborated on a Gertler project with our very own Evas Bernstock. So hi, Sarah, thank you for taking part and also joining us tonight to talk about the amazing work that you do at Ben Uri Gallery. And if it's okay, I will pass it over to you to get started. Great.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, that's all great, and your slides work perfectly.
Great, thank you so much, Layla, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this fantastic evening. I've been so absorbed in the other presentations that I'm sort of just coming into the right place now. So I wanted to say really that the title that you gave for this evening is really ever pertinent as an issue, clearly, and in relation to art as well. The issues of immigration and migration could not be more relevant to Ben Uri's own history, collection and vision. So I just wanted to begin by touching briefly on the complex terminology around migration and identity, and the problems of employing such loaded terms as émigré, exile, refugee, immigrant, and migrant, which are often used interchangeably despite implied distinctions. The state of exile, for example, to borrow German art historian Sabine Ekman's definition, is one in which the state is the active party, compelling the individual to relocate by, quote, deprivation of citizenship, banishment, persecution, end quote. Emigration, on the other hand, is by implication an individual act, active and voluntary. There is perhaps an expectation that the émigré will bring something with them. Work, perhaps, a reputation, connections, a network, while a refugee, often fleeing at a moment's notice, might be able to bring nothing with them, nothing material, that is, except their identity. Yet all can collectively be termed immigrants. To immigrate to or to emigrate from is only a verb after all, but often, particularly in certain sectors of the media, the terms immigration and immigrant have been seen as loaded or even as terms of abuse. In 2019, when Ben Uri set up its research unit for the study of the Jewish and immigrant contribution to visual arts in Britain since 1900, we sought to suggest the positive rather than negative connotations of this term. And I hope in this brief presentation to demonstrate how profoundly immigration has enriched and continues to do so, British visual art. Of course, we've already seen that from the fantastic earlier presentations. Ben Uri was founded by immigrants, specifically by a Russian Jewish immigrant, Lazar Berson, in London's East End in July 1915, as an arts society to provide a platform for and support fellow Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant artists and craftsmen working outside the traditional mainstream. It was named after Bezalel Ben Uri, the biblical creator of the tabernacle, the name chosen to indicate kinship with the Bezalel School of Art in Jerusalem, founded 9 years earlier. On screen is Berson's circular design, incorporating birds, flowers, signs of the zodiac, and Yiddish lettering. Yiddish was the first language of Ben Uri. And it was marking Ben Uri's progress towards the end of its first year. After his sudden departure in 1916, Ben Uri went on to form a significant collection of works by artists of British and European descent. Reflecting Ben Uri's heritage, the artworks are principally by late 19th century, 20th century and 21st century Jewish artists. Since 2002, however, our remit has expanded to include immigrant artists to the UK from all national, ethnic and religious origins. From 78 works in 1930, today the collection comprises some 1,500 works by 443 artists from 44 different countries, 2/3 of whom are immigrants, and incidentally 1/3 are women. As such, it reflects three principal waves of migration, the first reflecting our Eastern European Jewish immigrant founders, circa 1880 to 1910, who fled pogroms and ethnic persecution. The second, the so-called Hitler émigrés, mostly but not exclusively Jewish. We see Schwitter's work here on the screen. They fled Nazi religious, cultural and political persecution between 1933 and 45. And the third wave, currently the smallest part of our collection, but ever expanding, reflects the ongoing story of post-war immigration to this country. These same stories have also been reflected and explored extensively in our exhibition programming over the last 20 years, with a series of exhibitions focusing on forced journeys and the theme of migration. In 2015, Ben Uri marked its centenary with a 6-month exhibition, Out of Chaos, at Somerset House in London. This slide bookends the two sides of this by now familiar story. On the left, we have Mark Gertler's Rabbi and Rebbitzin from 1914, made on the eve of the First World War and set in his mother's East End kitchen. It encapsulates the story of the Jewish diaspora. On the right, we have a still from Edwin Mingard's film Break, a commissioned artistic response to Out of Chaos, telling the story of a recent Muslim immigrant to London, confronting the reality of living as a migrant in a big city, overwork, poor living and working conditions, a lack of rights, and the mental toll of being far from those he loves. Certain costumes, scenes, and shots in the film were inspired by or responded to artworks from the Ben Uri collection, including the Gertler that you see on the left. As the exhibition opened, tragic stories of migrant ships foundering at sea were daily hitting the headlines, making the works on display ever more poignant and relevant. This monumental canvas by Belgian artist Victor Hageman depicts 3 generations of one Jewish family gathered at the point of exile, ready to board a ship. It originally belonged to the Speth family in Antwerp, owners of the Red Star Line, which arranged for many Jewish immigrants to travel to America. Similarly, Joseph Herman's Refugees, painted around 1941 amidst the Second World War in Glasgow, draws on his heritage and evokes a lost Warsaw. Yet the refugees also represent the wider displacement of all peoples uprooted and forced into exile by the upheavals of war. The family's unknown fate is symbolised by the mouse dangling from the cat's jaw. The fearful child with her hand stuffed in her mouth reflects Herman's admiration for Goya's black pictures. Ostensibly, nothing could be more different than Frank Auerbach's bustling, vibrant, contemporary cityscape with its characteristic and energetically implied impasto, one of many iterations of the Camden Town area where the artist has rooted himself since 1954. Born to Jewish parents in Berlin in 1931, Auerbach was sent to England in 1939. His parents, who remained behind, subsequently perished in concentration camps. Opposite is a work by Eva Frankfurter, who also came as a child in the same year, but was reunited with her own Jewish family and studied alongside Auerbach at St. Martin's School of Art. Afterwards, she worked outside the artistic mainstream, focusing on figures on the margins, including documenting the new immigrant communities to London, particularly her friends among the Windrush generation. In 2016, Ben Uri collaborated with Counterpoints Arts to curate a contemporary response to migration in the exhibition Unexpected, with artists from immigrant backgrounds, including the Caribbean, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iran, Kurdistan, Pakistan, Turkey, and the former Yugoslavia, exploring journeys, displacement, loss, memory, and identity. Among them, Iranian artist Zori Sharoki's installation Flying, which you see on the left, comprising 54 hand-tied swallows made from scraps of Persian cloth sent to her by relatives. And on the right, Home Performance 2 by Eastern Turkish artist Gula Atiz, where a veiled figure crosses the foreground, pulling a house behind her, encapsulating the artist's notion that we carry our, quotes, mental home wherever we go. In the same exhibition was the handmade map of the world by Caribbean-born contemporary Black British artist Tam Joseph, who immigrated to England in 1955 at the age of 8, as Auerbach had done some 16 years earlier. Joseph's world has playfully, perhaps provocatively, reordered conventional geographies, blurring boundaries and suggesting new and unexpected possibilities. To close, our vision at Ben Uri is to continue to tell and expand upon these stories of migration to the UK via our new digital platform, showcasing our collection, the work of our research unit, and digital exhibitions such as the recent Midnight's Family, 70 Years of Indian Artists in Britain, co-curated by Indian-born painter Shanti Panchal and Ben Uri's Rachel Dixon, as well as publications and the work of our Arts and Health Institute, supported by our gallery, library and archive space in St. John's Wood, which will reopen next year, we hope, with our Gustav Metzger exhibition and a newly expanded research library. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so inspiring to see how much amazing work you and your team are doing and have been doing. I think everyone's just so engrossed in listening to all of us that they haven't actually sent through any questions. So I will give it just another few seconds to see if anything comes through. And if not, we'll just move on. That's okay. Yeah, so thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to our last segment of the episode. So tonight we're thrilled to have Thembe Mvula joining us to perform a one-off poetic reinterpretation of a work from our collection, Head of a Woman. So Thembe is a South African-born poet, currently based in London. She's a Barbican young poet and Roundhouse Poetry Collective alumni. She's performed nationally and internationally and has headlined at Uniqlo, Tate Late's, Jaw Dance, and also Afro Arts Festival. It's wonderful to have you here. So we're just going to share the work that you've chosen today. That's okay. Great. Hello, I can see you now.
Hi, can you hear me okay as well?
Yeah, we can. So I wondered if you wanted to just say maybe a little sentence or two about why you chose this work and why you felt like it was fitting to this theme today.
Yeah, so I think initially thinking about the theme, I was kind of reflecting on how during Black History Month which is celebrated in October in the UK, obviously, it's when we kind of remind ourselves of other prominent Black figures who have made history and played a part in shaping British culture. But often that's kind of very much made prominent in that space and time of the year, rather than it being a general part of history as we know. And I was just reflecting on a personal level as well on the impact of trailblazing Black women who have shaped British art that has impacted me a lot as well. And I was kind of looking through the collections, and this one really struck me, and I really became fixated on it, and fixated on also that it didn't have a name, in reflecting on the theme. So it just kind of all came together, and I was really inspired by it. And so, yeah, that's the poem is very much inspired by that. That'll be sharing.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to you to get started. Thanks.
No worries. So the poem is a sestina, just to give a little bit of context. So there is quite a bit of repetition, but it felt very intentional and very suited for this poem, which usually is used to kind of highlight a specific person. And hopefully the poem will speak for itself enough, but I just wanted to add that little bit of context there. Here sits the head of a woman. It was once identified as mask of a Negro, a muse I wish to make a monument out of, not a mere bronze bodiless figure immortalized, but inscribed in gold, with her autograph for posing as art. I wish for all Black bodies to be remembered this way, a face with a body, a voice, and a name. What virtues deem a person worthy to have their name etched in history, to have their legacy identified? What's it like to live and know that you will be remembered? To have your spirit split between heaven and an earthly monument, to attract eyes from far and wide to witness your art, to know that you will be immortalized. Did this head of a woman lie down and dream of being immortalized? Glimpse herself existing in a future as a household name where generations pay homage to and admire her art, where her face and skin do not limit how she's identified, and her ancestral legacy is as significant as a wall monument pointing to the sky, those who are worthy of being remembered. Mallory Blackman, Malika Booker, and Bernadine Evaristo will be remembered. Like Phyllis Wheatley and Mary Prince, their words will be immortalized among trailblazers who slipped from history's memory. Monumental musicians and mathematicians who retained a name noble to be preserved, passed down like an heirloom, identified and celebrated. This too is an art. But to see this head of a Black woman as art, behold her round cheeks and thick lips being remembered, smooth and cold as real life, carved with someone else's name, is an empty honoring of her flesh being immortalized. Her face will outlast her person in being remembered. I wonder if she ever wanted to be a monument. So I craft this poem as a monument, a spoken shrine in her honor. She art invisible in this bronze casting void of her name, This poem is a way for a Black woman to be remembered, to be immortalized, and most of all, identified. What good is a name when there are other ways to be identified? When the world renders you lifeless and resurrects you an immortalized, bodiless, nameless ornament that is unremembered. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so beautiful, and what a fantastic way to finish this episode. I wanted to tie up again by thanking everyone, all of our panelists, for giving us plenty to think about, and also for everyone at home for tuning in, and also the Research Forum team for managing the tech behind the scenes. So I hope lots of you can join us for our next Open Courtauld Hour, which will be called Rainbow Lenses on the 3rd of December. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.